It's a great honor to be here, particularly in a venue in which people are looking at the future, and you have government officials and academics and others actually taking seriously the challenge of the future and trying to think about appropriate policies. I'm grateful to David is sort of setting up in his talk talking about the importance of social technologies, because my talk is going to be on the social singularity, and that is the real implications of not just the fact that you are having lots of technologies, hard technologies, nanotech, biotech, or AI, but how we're reframing and rethinking fundamental institutions. Because all this exponential change is going to create social and cultural change. And we're having what I call phase shift, not just sort of a exponential change, but really a step function change in which we're creating new kinds of realities, new kinds of environments. And the key drivers to this, in my talk I want to focus on, are the whole point of virtualization. Brad Templeton brought this up earlier, talking about digitalization, the fact that everything's becoming software, everything's becoming programmable, everything's being dematerialized. I think this is a very, very important point to stress. And with that becomes a challenge to how do you create, when you're creating a totally digital virtual world, how is a world that you can trust and you can govern and you can make it work for the benefit of others and for the planet? And I think that this is happening very fast. It's really on us, and that part of my talk is going to be on decentralized technologies, blockchain technologies, new kinds of crypto tokens, self-organizing systems as being a whole new technology base that's going to help us rethink our fundamental institutions. Now, Ray Kurzweil talked about the singularity primarily as a future period, which the pace of technology is so vast that it creates another reality. I think that with a sense of an event horizon, or something that is on one side you're seeing the world one way, and the other side you're seeing the world another way, in fact, I think that's an accurate description. And we've talked about, many of the earlier speakers talked about exponential change, Moore's law. We talked about genomics. It's really a hypercurve, but it's more than a hypercurve. It's a fusion of different technologies that are coming together. Anyone who's been working in biology knows biology is being transformed by computer science. It's become digital. So that combined with what we know in nanotech, they're all fusing together to create an alternative reality. And I like to think about this as not just, again, just not a step, not just an exponential function, but a step function in which you have like 3 different phases. And each phase has a plateau, and that plateau creates a new ecology, a new reality. The one that we are in right now is the virtualization. Everything's becoming digitized. We can experience that. We know that. And there's a phase after that where we're looking at directed evolution. I think we heard people talking about that. And then there's a phase beyond that, and that may be the singularity, in which we're talking about artificial nature. We're having, whether it be robots, whether it be all sorts of self-organizing systems that are acting on their own, but it's beyond sort of human agency and control. And these are not sort of two to the end changes. These are like end to the end changes, things that combine upon themselves. And so we talk about the Internet of Things. Well, there's the Internet of thinking things, because what we're doing is we're putting cognition, thinking, agency out into the edge of the network. And these things are talking to one another. And there's no way that we can control them ourselves. We can't interpose human direction and control on them. These things are relatively autonomous. And this is the environment in which we're immersing ourselves in. Now, a lot of these ideas are not that old, not that new. These are some of the prophets of this technology. There's the figure on the left, my left, is Warren McCulloch. Warren McCulloch developed something called the McCulloch and Pitts neural networks. They were the first kind of perceptrons, the sort of automata theory, who started getting people talking about self-organizing networks. And then there's Norbert Wiener, who invented cybernetics. A lot of people don't appreciate the magnitude of some of these ideas. And these were all Wiener did most of his work during the war, the Second World War, then a bit afterwards. And then there's Ross Ashby, who invented the concept of self-organizing system. He's a cybernetician. He developed and he brought forth the notion of self-organization in 1938, I think. So these are older ideas. And in the photograph below, you have Claude Shannon, who invented information theory, and then you have John McCarthy, who actually invented the term AI, and he invented Lisp, which is a symbolic programming language. And he's joined by Ed Fredkin, who was the first sort of physicist, a digital physicist, who looked at the universe as being digital. And Joe Weizenbaum is another. And this is pretty MIT partial. This is at MIT. But now we have the complexity sciences and Stephen Wolfram's work, a new kind of science, in which you're talking about very simple principles that if they're iterated over and over again, you get emergence of intelligence, reflection. You get the ability to have what they call something Turing complete. You have the ability of a Turing machine to compute anything that's computable at a very simplest level. There's a famous rule, 110, that basically, over time, you create these replications, iterations, you can create a Turing complete pattern. So what we're saying about is intelligence, when we think about intelligence, and that's a long conversation, but it's sort of inherent in the patterns of things, that it naturally emerges. Down below, there's a work by John Holland. John Holland is famous for doing work in complex adaptive systems, but he also is the father of genetic algorithms. He talked about how he can mimic nature through genetic algorithms. And that's become the basis of designing very, very sort of rapidly evolving systems. And so what this means, really, is that there's sort of a set of principles here that we're looking at networks, signaling networks, self-organizing networks at different levels of complexity that basically are the underpinning of how we start to understand reality. So even at the sort of the molecular level, all the way up to the social level, all the way up to the ecological level, there's certain patterns of behavior and emergence. And I think what we're starting to understand is an even really simple, what we think is simple mechanisms. Cellular signaling systems are very complex. They're Turing complete. So we're living in this world of massively communicating things, and we're embedded in that. And basically, we're embedded in a universe of expanding data. This is the world we're in. And this wasn't true 50 years ago. We lived in a physical world. We looked at the digital world, but we're now a part of this digital data universe. And these ideas were anticipated 50, 60, 70 years ago with the concept of the noosphere. I don't know if many people know about that, but as a kid, I read his book. And he talked about the geosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere, which was the sphere of knowledge. And there was this whole idea that you have this layering and evolution that's taking place. And it was a ridiculed concept, and actually he was defrocked from the church for having it. But it sort of pointed to the beginning of the internet. And so when we think about human evolution and how we co-evolved and why we are what we are, what is the world that we are adapted to? We came off a savanna plain. We're roughly 200,000 years old. Then we had the glaciers come in, and we adapted to that, and we had migratory patterns. We're relatively small. We did begin in Africa. There's a small group that came out of Africa 60,000 years ago and populated the world. But we were adapted to something that was, let's see if we get that, that was not like the world we're in today. Right now, we're in highly dense, highly interconnected worlds. We evolved in something that was very sparse. So if you look at Homo sapiens, we're roughly 200,000 years old. 190,000 years of that was spent as hunters and gatherers. Relatively small, at a time where we're sedentary in settled agriculture and domestication. And then you look at industrialization. It's a small period. And digitalization is smaller. And then when we talk about the singularity, that's even a smaller component. But the point I'm trying to make here is that we evolved, our responses, our neurological systems, our physical responses, our cognitive abilities, our reptilian brain, our basic responses are based upon a world that's really 200,000 years old. And we're rapidly moving into another world. And so we're in what I call a trans trend. We're violating we're crossing boundaries all the time. Things that defined who we were, that gave us comfort, and something is elemental, is gender identification. Facebook has identified people self-identify 51 different kinds of gender options. How they do that, I don't know. But you have trans species. You have the ability to go across the species, take genetic content of one and add it to another to create a new kind of species, a chimera. And then we're all redrawing boundaries among nation states. So all the categories that we've been comfortable with, that we help define who we are, is being radically changed. And it's not something we're controlling, it's happening to us. So there's this fusion of what it means to be human with technology, and this period of transhumanism. In a lot of ways, we think of ourselves as being separate from nature. We have an envelope, we're a particular species, but in fact, ourselves, we are embedded in an ecological system where we have 37 trillion cells, but we're also composed of 100 trillion bacteria. We're a colony of cooperating microorganisms. So even what we define as ourselves, our boundary of our own system, is not something that we're controlled. We're embedded in other systems. And so when we talk about the change, the coevolution, what's going to happen to what I think is the human envelope, everything gets packaged. We're unpacking the human envelope, and we're creating a more flexible evolutionary envelope. And so we're going this first phase of dematerialization. And I think it's really hard to appreciate the magnitude of that. So when you go from atoms, not to bits, but I would argue to qubits, quantum bits, and your virtualization of everything. That's hard to assimilate. But it is a new scientific basis. I mean, when you looked at the Industrial Revolution, why did the Industrial Revolution take place? Well, part of it is based upon Newtonian physics. So we had a new science. That new science allowed us to build new kind of technology. We had a new way of thinking about and ordering the world. Now we're moving into a more quantum mechanics world, which is very different. You don't have on and off. You don't have a simple on and off switch. You actually have qubits. You have 3 different states. You have the state of what something is being changed by the act of measuring it or creating a quantum computer. So there are quantum computers available now. One can dispute whether they're fully quantum-based, but it's clearly something that's happening. And we have a different image of reality. And this Max Tegmark is a physicist at MIT, and he said consciousness can be understood as a state of matter, perceptronium. This is an unthinkable concept 20 years ago, because we used to think about science as being material, objective measurements, replicating those measurements. Now it's gotten very murky. And so we are creating these environments, these overlays, these new environments where we're inhabiting. That's not just the physical, but we're creating a digital layer on top of that that's going to respond to us. So imagine a building that can talk back to you. So it's not just a physical space, it's an interactive space. And if it sort of knew who you were, could tailor its response to you. So this is like an art project, but it's the beginning of creating an alternative realities. Now this case, I want you to guess and see what's causing this. If this were happened 50 years ago, they would say, oh, they're witches. There's something unusual is happening. What are these people chasing? Why are they doing what they're doing? How can you explain this behavior? Thousands of people. They do it around the world. No one's forcing them to do it. What's Pokemon? It's Pokemon. They're chasing a Pokemon. And Pokemon is very interesting in the sense that it set the Guinness World Book of Record for the fastest growing app. And you created a whole virtualized society overnight. You created a way of incentivizing people, paying the system. It became its own economy. So we're moving into a world in which the ability to live and navigate in that world and function in that world is going to be dependent on our ability to understand the augmented reality. And here's another rendering of this. This is done by a Japanese artist. It's a longer piece.
Thank you.
But the point being here is that you've got to get control over the augmented reality. What is happening in a digital world is what is happening is important is a physical world. Similarly with the concept, we're moving into a hypermind where everything is connected to everything else. And the point is that data are the new water. It's not a set of observations, it's a medium in which we live. And the devices are talking to each other, and we want the devices to connect with each other. We don't want them to be toxic. We don't want them to be poisoned. We want them to be rich in water. Water is the new origin of creating our new kind of digital. Data is a new digital life. But the fact is, what's happened about this is that we have the device that's enabling this is really, my phone is a spy phone. Who controls that phone? Your phone is collecting data on you, is building models of who you are. The whole AI behind that, instead of Google Now, is it making predictive models about who you are, who you're interacting with. And it's a learning device, but it's a learning device you don't necessarily control. So the big question is, we're creating this digital world. It's a totally constructed world, but what do we trust? Who are the authorities that we can trust? And this becomes a huge challenge. Because our sense of regulations, our ways of thinking about it, are based in an old world. It's really still an industrial age. So we say, well, you're doing something wrong, well, do not collect the data. If you don't collect the data, you can't see. You can opt out. People say you don't have to participate in this world, but if you opt out, you can become a pariah. So you have to be in the world. And you say, well, every time you do something, why don't you have notification and consent? Well, if you do that, this happens so often, it's a denial of service attack. So there are all these ways of thinking about regulation and oversight that are based upon an old model that just don't apply to the digital world. This is a real challenge. And one of the reasons being is that our whole sense of authorities are based, we've had for thousands of years, are very static and hierarchical. We have kinship systems that, based upon how you define a kinship system, defines what kind of roles and opportunities you have. All the way up to the medieval notion of the medieval chain of being. Who you are in that hierarchy depends how your life is going to be unfold. And so we have different kinds of artifacts of identities and access that get people access to certain kinds of resources. But if you don't have those, you're in bad shape. So if you look at this whole question about on the upper hand right, there's the little look like thumbprints. Those are indulgences. The Catholic Church would sell indulgences to give you access to heaven. So authorities try to monetize and create control points to give control the value of being created. So we're at a point where we're going to have to look at autonomous technologies. Can we have governance without governments? Can we have authorization without authorities? This is a big challenge. And this is happening faster than we think. Because if you find the car, this is 1904 in New York, and then you look at 1912, there are no horses. Suddenly you went from horses to cars in an 8-year period. So this is happening very fast. So I want to have a little video talking about blockchain technologies and why blockchain technology is so important in this new kind of infrastructure.
When you vote, have you ever wondered whether your ballot is actually counted? If you meet someone online, how do you know they're who they say they are? When you buy coffee that's labeled fair trade, what makes you so certain of its origin? To be sure, really sure, about any of those questions, you'd need a system where records could be stored, facts could be verified by anyone, and security is guaranteed. That way, no one could cheat the system by editing records, because everyone using the system would be watching. Systems like this are on the horizon, and the software that powers them is called a blockchain. Blockchains store information across a network of personal computers, making them not just decentralized, but distributed. This means no central company or person owns the system, yet everyone can use it and help run it. This is important because it means it's difficult for any one person to take down the network or corrupt it. The people who run the system use their computer to hold bundles of records submitted by others, known as blocks, in a chronological chain. The blockchain uses a form of math called cryptography to ensure that records can't be counterfeited or changed by anyone else. You've probably heard of the blockchain's first killer app, a form of digital cash called Bitcoin that you can send to anyone, even a complete stranger. Bitcoin is different from credit cards, PayPal, or other ways to send money because there isn't a bank or financial middleman involved. Instead, people from all over the world help move the digital money by validating others' Bitcoin transactions with their personal computers, earning a small fee in the process. Bitcoin uses the blockchain by tracking records of ownership over this digital cash, so only one person can be the owner at a time and the cash can't be spent twice, like counterfeit money in the physical world can. But Bitcoin is just the beginning for blockchains. In the future, blockchains that manage and verify online data could enable us to launch companies that are entirely run by algorithms, making self-driving cars safer, help us protect our online identities, and even track the billions of devices on the Internet of Things. These innovations will change our lives forever, and it's all just the beginning.
So I want to accelerate this a little bit, so you have tokens of trust and tokens of value that are being created, and these can be exchanged. And these ideas are very fundamental in changing the whole financial infrastructure, the whole financial system. And you had someone no less than Christine Lagarde, who's head of the IMF, saying that cryptocurrencies, blockchains, these may be soon displacing the current financial system. And what becomes important is that how do we create credentials that of people, that when you have to share all this information, that what makes this economy work is being accessed to information and the most personal information. So if you can have mobility services, the kind of things that Brad was talking about earlier, you have to collect all this kind of data on people. And this data is very, very sensitive data. But what you can do is give people control over this, and you can become your own password. You can become your own biobehavioral metric, and you can have control over that. That is a new way of thinking about these things. And what you can do is create credentials. Credentials of trust, credentials of value, and you create baskets of them, and based on what combination of credentials you can have, you can create exchanges, and you can create a highly flexible and liquid system that actually is trust-based. And so what we're moving into is a world of network cities. This is a new environment, not the savannah of the plain. This is where human beings are going to be undergoing rapid selection. These are all learning nodes. And the question is, how do we make them trusted? So the conclusion is, the social singularity is really now. And really, we are creating these divisive internet thinking things, and we need to be able to create mechanisms for governance that have the complexity and sophistication of the technologies we're creating. So thank you very much.